Our banking system is sound.
In the past 2 weeks, serious difficulties at a small number of banks have emerged.
These banks are safe.
All depositors' savings in the banking system are safe.
The banking system in the United States is sound and resilient.
Banking system is sound. Banking system is sound. Banking system is sound. Banking system is sound and resilient.
A rough week for the banking industry.
The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, the second biggest bank collapse in U.S. history.
The Silicon Valley Bank collapse is the worst since 2008.
Social Security is structurally sound.
As president, I will not cut one penny from Social Security or Medicare.
There's an imminent disaster waiting. I mean, that's where we're headed.
2 balls, 2 strikes to Bryce Harper. Suarez delivers. Swing and a drive. Left field. It's deep. It's going. Yes! And it is gone. Yes! It is bedlam at the bank as Bryce Harper has put the Phillies on top.
Thank you for tuning in to podcast number 8 of Bogus Banks, Behemoth Bubbles, and Baseball Betting. I'm your host, Chase Goldman, and today is Thanksgiving Day, November 26th, 2025. I want to give full credit to Peter Schiff for calling my attention to this one. I've heard him say this story several times, and he went over it again on his most recent podcast this week. But, most people don't really know what Thanksgiving is really actually about. And I think that's by design. I think the Rockefeller-funded textbooks and the school curriculums have intentionally made sure that we don't understand this, because somebody up on Mount High has this agenda to create a communist utopia. But what happened was the Pilgrims had come over here in the early 1600s, and they conducted an experiment with communism. You might call it socialism, but the way it was supposed to work was they were just going to come over here and everybody was going to put their best foot forward, and they were all going to work to feed themselves and, build a community. And invariably what would happen is you'd have, one member of that community go out and work his butt off to create a bountiful harvest of corn or whatever his specialty was, maybe chicken, maybe he was a hunter, maybe he was a fisherman, but or maybe he was the guy that got firewood. Regardless, that guy would work his butt off, and he'd bring his harvest into the group, and then other people in that group would sit around on their butt and not do anything and pretend like they're hurt or something like that, and they would also eat just as well as him. And so, of course, that would piss off the guys that are doing all the production, and so ultimately they finally just said, what's the point? Let's all just starve. And so the Pilgrims damn near starved to death with this communist experiment that they tried in the early 1600s. And then finally, I think it was a Governor Bradford, they decided, all right, well, everybody can have their own private land now. You can own the land, and they brought in capitalism. And once they brought in capitalism, then the guy who was busting his butt to go get firewood, he could go trade that with the guy who was growing corn, or he could trade it with the guy who had chickens, or he could trade it with the fisherman. And it was just capitalism. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. And so that fall, they had a very bountiful harvest. There was plenty for everyone once they switched over to capitalism. But that story's been completely left out of our history books. I mean, they just don't teach us that in the schools, along with so many other things. But I wanted to go back into the trade. Nobody rings a bell. I'm still alive on that trade. I'm still thinking that there's going to be some significance to that ringing of the bell when Andrew Ross Sorkin rang that bell on the New York Stock Exchange, and the next day S&P 500 hits its all-time high. That high has stood now for a month, for 4 weeks, and if it doesn't break that high on Friday, it'll have a solid month in. And I don't know, I get the feeling that these markets are just going to keep going up. This market that we've been handed since 2018, certainly 2020. There's no pullbacks anymore, and if there is a pullback, all you have to do is wait a month and it's over. All your pain is over with, and the markets just march on. NASDAQ makes 1% every single day. Just hold NASDAQ and you'll win. Everybody gets a trophy in this market. Nobody loses, and earnings just don't matter anymore. I was looking at the S&P 500, and the earnings of the S&P 500, there was a famous investor. He was a value investor. I believe his name was Charles DeVaux. Peter Schiff had talked about him on a podcast years ago. Well, he was a value investor, a very famous value investor, and he had seen his assets under management shrink from 20 billion to 1 billion. So he finally closed his fund in April of 2021 and committed suicide. And that's the way value investing has gone for, I don't know, the last decade pretty much, certainly the last 5 years. And I looked at the S&P 500, and the earnings of the S&P 500 at that time were, let me see if I've got that. They were they've increased by 28% since this guy committed suicide. So the earnings in the S&P 500 are up 28%, but the index, the S&P 500, is up 66%. And to me, the real question is how much of those S&P 500 earnings are fake. But we're going to get to that a little bit later in the show, in the podcast. But I do want to go back and just refresh everyone's memory. So I saw this thing where Andrew Ross Sorkin was ringing the bell at the New York Stock Exchange, the opening bell, standing in front of a sign, a giant sign about a stock market crash. It was the 1929 stock market crash. And that crash was in October of 1929. That is a 1029. And then the very next day after Sorkin rings that opening bell, the S&P 500 hit its all-time high on October 29th. That is another 1029. Okay, well, I that was enough to get me in the trade because I'm thinking these markets are completely fake. The only explanation for these markets is if they are real and it's not a video game, is that everyone's under the influence of a witch's spell. I mean, that makes more sense to me than actual real people out here buying into this market right now. That's my opinion. But I go back and forth because I did learn during COVID how utterly stupid humanity was when they complied with all that tyranny and then they lined up for their shots in 2021. That blew my mind. So I don't know. Maybe humanity is dumb enough to buy this market and think that it's a good investment. I don't. It doesn't resonate with me. But anyway, I wanted to go over that, and then we had Oz Perlman come on. He was a guy from Israel. And I think I went over this on the last podcast. I'll go over this story again just real briefly to refresh everyone's memory. So this would have been about 3 weeks after Andrew Ross Sorkin rang the opening bell, standing in front of a stock market, a giant sign about a stock market crash. You know that saying, nobody rings a bell. Well, I think they rang a bell for us, is what I think. And that high still holds, even though the S&P 500 only needs to go up another 1.5% to take out that former all-time high of October 29th. Will it do it? We'll see. We'll see. There's plenty of reasons for the market to go down. We're going to be getting to that later in the podcast as well. But Oz Perlman was invited onto the set of CNBC. I woke up real early one day last week, and I was wondering if, does CNBC even have programming this early? So I got my iPad and opened up Fubo, and sure enough, there's this Oz Perlman guy sitting there with Joe Kernan and Andrew Ross Sorkin, and he's doing a magic trick. And he says, okay, Joe, I want you to pick a year and a year. Well, he says, first of all, what if you knew when the market was going to top and bottom, what would you do? And Sorkin says, well, I'd short the market and get rich. And, he says, what if you knew the beginning and the end, the top of the market and the bottom of the market, or something along those lines? You can watch that on YouTube if you just type in Oz Perlman, CNBC. You'll find that there. He says, what would you do if you knew the beginning and the end, when the market was going to top and when it was going to bottom? And then he goes into this whole tirade about, Joe, pick a year, any year over the next 10 years. So Joe picks 2027. He turns to Sorkin. He says, now you pick a date. He picks July 6th. So then he gets out a poster board and a marker and he writes down 7/06/27. He does not write down the 0 in front of the 7, just a 7/06/27. So then he goes into the next part of his little act and the casting of his spell. And he says, what did he say? He says, now what I want you to do is I want you to open up so he gives Andrew Ross Sorkin a copy of his 1929 Stock Market Crash, the book that Sorkin wrote. And he says, I want you to open this up and find the page that is calling your name. And he gives Joe Kernan a copy of his book, Oz Perlman's book. And he says, I want you to do the same with my book. Open up the page, open the book and find the page that's calling your name and hold it close to your body. So they each open the books and hold an open book up against their chest. And he says, now, Andrew, I want you to find the first word on the page that was calling your name, memorize it and close the book. And then he says, Kernan, I want you to find the last word. Now remember, when you go to witchcraft, 1s and 9s are very important. That's why we see all this recurring in 9/11 and COVID-19. These 1s and 9s are very important to the witches. And he says, Kernan, so they represent, and 1 and 9, 1 represents beginnings, 9 represents endings, which is exactly where he opened up with. What if you knew the beginning and the ending? Remember? Now he says the first, and he says, Kernan, you take the last page on your book, memorize it and close your book. They both do that. And then he says, here's a poster board. I want you to each write down your word. Or first of all, he says, recite the middle letter. They both say G at the exact same time. They look at each other and they look all puzzled and freaked out. And then they both write down their word on their poster. So then he says, all right, now flip them over at the exact same time. And both guys have written down the word legal. Then he takes his poster, which has 70627, and he flips that poster upside down and it says legal. So we have 3 poster boards on the set of CNBC and the book about the 1929 stock market crash, all saying legal. So that leads me to believe, hey, maybe they're going to bottom this market. We're going to top on 1029.25. We're going to get into a severe bear market, and it's going to bottom. This market's going to crash, and the bottom's going to be on July 6, 2027. Now that one's a little bit of a reach. I don't know if it'll actually work out that way, but there is something. I say there's something about that word legal, and I wonder if that's going to be bail-ins instead of bailouts for some of the banks, or maybe all the banks. I don't know. It's very hard for me to believe they wouldn't bail out the banks, because if they do that, all of corporate America goes bankrupt, everybody loses their jobs, but that might be what they want. I don't know. I can't figure it all out, but I think they'll print the money and take the easy way out. They always do. That's what I'm betting on. But let me just go back and set the table. I've added a few more notes to the table setting that I recited on the last podcast. So TSA check-ins, I track them on a spreadsheet. Every morning when I'm having my coffee. I think there's no better indicator of the economy than TSA check-ins. So year to date, TSA check-ins are up a whopping 0.45% versus the same travel days, weekdays, in 2024. Now, just to be clear, if today is, say for example, today's a Thursday, you want to compare that Thursday to the same Thursday a year ago. You don't want to compare the 27th to the 27th because that won't give you the same travel day. Remember, travel days are heavy on Mondays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Sundays. And they're light on Saturdays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. That's when you pretty much, your business travel is on those 4 heavy days, and then you just have consumers only, pretty much vacationers traveling on the 3 light days. But TSA check-ins don't jive with the stock market being up 15 to 20%. S&P's up, I think, 16% year to date, and Nasdaq's up 20. You've got TSA check-ins coming in at 0.5% growth. Las Vegas, the nation's discretionary spending barometer, in my opinion, has seen a 7.8% year-over-year drop in visitors versus last year. Now that was through, I believe, August. And they're estimating that through the first 8 months, that's 1.8 million fewer tourists coming to Vegas this year versus last. The Challenger job cuts in October were the highest they've been for the month of October in 22 years. 1 in 20 U.S. households has been sent to collections by their electric company, with overdue balances up 32% from 2022. 789 on average versus 597 3 years ago. Subprime auto loan delinquencies are at all-time highs. Auto repossessions are also at all-time highs. 401k hardship withdrawals are at all-time highs. Those are the guys that are like, I got to have my money. I don't care. I've got bills to pay. I'll pay the 10% penalty with the IRS to get my money out early. That's what a 401k hardship withdrawal is. Those aren't loans. I would just want to make that clear. But those hardship withdrawals are at all-time highs. Office commercial real estate delinquencies. Now, when we say that, we're talking about any city in the United States. They all have a skyline with skyscrapers. Those are predominantly office buildings. Those offices are empty, or a lot emptier than they should be in order to make those things pencil out. And the delinquencies on those loans, this is office CRE, commercial real estate. Office commercial real estate delinquencies are at all-time highs. Student loan delinquencies are also at all-time highs. Unemployment rates for recent college graduates are at all-time highs. It has become normal now for kids to get out of college. When I got out of college in 92, it was normal for college kids. They might move in with roommates like I did, some other college friends, but we would go get a job in an apartment. That was normal back then. Today, it's more normal for college kids to get out of college, graduate from college, and move back home with mom and dad. That's more normal than getting in your own place when you get out of college today. Housing unaffordability is at an all-time high. Residential electric bills are at an all-time high. Auto insurance premiums are at an all-time high. Health insurance premiums are at an all-time high. Corporate bankruptcy filings through October are on pace for the worst year in 15 years. That goes back to 2010 when the great financial crisis was ending. I think they're on pace for like 850 large corporate bankruptcies this year. I think the all-time high was back in I want to say maybe it was 2009, somewhere in there. I think it was 1600 is where they peaked last time. But I think things are headed towards that direction now. But yeah, corporate bankruptcies are increasing. Market concentration, the S&P 500. The top 10 stocks in that index make up 42% of the entire market cap of the S&P 500. The other 490 only make up 58%. That is what we call market concentration at 42%. That is by far and away an all-time high for market concentration risk. Credit card debt, $1.23 trillion, an all-time high. Margin debt, that's people that are being greedy with their trading account at, Ameriprise or Schwab or Fidelity or whatever. They're buying on margin because they don't want to just have their stocks go up that they can afford to buy with cash. They want to borrow money, buy more stocks, and that way when they go up, they can get even richer that much quicker. Margin debt, $1 trillion. $1 trillion in margin debt. That's an all-time high. And I can tell you with that much margin debt, when this thing starts to roll over and go down, it's going to be a bloodbath. It's going to drop fast because everybody's going to be getting those margin calls and they're going to be forced to sell at the price they can get. It's going to be, I think that'll be fast and furious. 40 to 45% of the components that make up the Russell 2000 are unprofitable. Historically, the ratio of insider buying to insider selling normally hovers around somewhere like 3 to 1. So with insider selling, you're always going to have more selling than buying because everybody gets these free stock options, and then they have to pay bills, they need the income, they want to buy something, so they're selling. Okay, that's normal. You're always going to have more sells than buys. If you get the ratio of buying and selling on an insider for a company that gets down to 1 to 1, that's, in my opinion, that's a very good sign because the insiders are risking their own cash to buy stock in that company. But historically, that will average about 3 to 1. So you'll have 3 times as much selling, insider sells, as you will insider buys. Today, that ratio for the S&P 500 is about 5 to 1. But for the Mag 7, the ratio right now is about 14 to 1 over the last few months. 14 to 1. CNBC, they're debating whether or not the stock market is in a bubble. Now, I'll tell you this much. If I'm going to be invested in a market, I think I'd rather wait for a market that's not being debated as to whether or not it is or is not a bubble. Why would you want to be invested in a market that they're debating could be a bubble? To me, that's just no-brainer. Get out, get on the sidelines. That just, to me, that indicates so much risk. But I guess other people around me just can't see it, or maybe these markets are a fake video game. All I know is when the markets bottomed in March of '09, I seriously doubt anybody was debating whether or not the market was in a bubble. So now I want to take a little bit of time to explain why I think the markets they've had every opportunity to crash and they still just don't, and maybe that's what it was like for Michael Burry during the great financial crisis, just waiting on those things to implode. He had to close down his Scion Asset Management firm. Now, I just to refresh your memory, Michael Burry was the guy in the movie The Big Short. I think the actor's name was Christian Bale, where he played, it seems like he played the air drums or the air guitar, I can't remember. I think it was air drums in an office. And he was waiting on his credit default swaps to pay off. And, the whole market was deteriorating and he should have seen his credit default swaps moving and he should have been getting, paid, but he wasn't getting paid and he's just sitting there waiting. That's kind of what I feel like right now with this short position. But the market has had more than enough opportunity to crash at this point. Now, Sam Altman, he is I guess he's the CEO of, I guess that's his title, of OpenAI. Now, just for those who don't know, OpenAI is the company that owns ChatGPT. Okay, so OpenAI is committed to spend $1.4 trillion over the next, 4 years or something like that, maybe 5, on new compute is what they call it. He's committed to spend 1.4 trillion. And so he was on a conference call and a Zoom meeting with some of the other investors, and he was asked about, hey Sam, how are you going to be able to spend $1.4 trillion? What's your plan? How do we see this happening, or something like that? I mean, it was a very common sense question. And Sam says, hey, if you'd like, I can find somebody else to buy your shares for you. Enough. He shouts enough. And I'm like, what did I just see? The guy should have had an answer to that question ready to go. He should have a business plan. It sounds like he has no business plan. His business plan is hope, is what it sounds like to me. Now, this company, we were able to figure out, well, not me, but other investors were able to figure out by digging through, I believe it was the third quarter 10Q from Microsoft, because Microsoft is invested in OpenAI. And we're going to get into that and just hear a little bit about the whole circle jerk that's going on with that. But we were able to figure out that Microsoft had basically a $3 billion loss, I want to say, from their investment in OpenAI that flowed through their P&L statement. And by extrapolation and figuring out how much of the company that Microsoft owns, which I think is about a third, basically everybody's thinking that OpenAI in the third quarter lost $12 billion. Sam Altman has said that he expects his annualized run rate revenue when he exits 2025 to be about $20 billion. Now, that's not all. There's more to this weird story. Now, but the thing is that 1.4 trillion in spending that he's committed to, that's what Oracle went to their shareholders with, and they said we have these. What was the? I can't remember the name of the term, but they had some fancy term for revenue they were going to get in the future, and it was hundreds of billions of dollars, and the stock went up 20% when they announced their earnings. Now, I can tell you as a gold mining investor, that will never happen with a gold miner. They're never going to get, an earnings release and the stock pops 20% in one day. That just ain't going to happen. The whole market just feels so fake to me. But yeah, they lost 20 billion. They're going to come out, exit this year running 20 billion a year. But then a couple days ago, it was actually last weekend, I think the story came out. I don't know when it initially came out. Apparently, the very first company to run the story was The Information. They had an article that they reported on a leaked internal memo from Sam Altman to OpenAI employees. And the memo warned that OpenAI could see single-digit revenue growth in 2026. So, if he's propping up this whole AI bubble, or he's propping up a lot of it with his spending commitments of 1.4 trillion, and if OpenAI's revenue growth comes in anything below 10% for 2026, I'm telling you right now that story should have crashed the entire stock market. Should have crashed the entire bubble. It should have just popped it instantly. But it didn't. And the only somewhat mainstream news source that reported that story was the Economic Times out of India. The entirety of the U.S. financial mainstream corporate press is just absolutely radio silent on this. So when I see things like this, that's where I go back to, hey, I think there's a very, very tiny group of people that control everything, especially the press. And so they didn't want that out there. And so that it doesn't add up with me, because my thesis was they're ready to pop this bubble and they want to take it down. Now, maybe they're going to run that story over the weekend in the mainstream corporate news and crash the markets on Monday. I don't know. I doubt it. I think if they had their chance to run the story and they didn't run it. So why did they censor that story and hide it? It sure looks like they want to keep this bubble going. But I just don't know. Again, I've got that line in the sand. S&P 6,920 was the intraday high on October 29th. If it gets back to that level, I'm closing my NASDAQ shorts and I'm done with this trade. I'll lose a little bit of money. But if for anybody else that thinks I'm not crazy and wants to get into the trade, you can pretty much get into it at about the same price that I got into it tomorrow morning, on Friday morning. The markets will be open for the first, I think, 3 or 4 hours of the day, and then they'll close early for the holiday weekend. They always do on Thanksgiving. But, in the last 4 trading days, NASDAQ has just win. It was up 185 points. It was up, I think, 450 intraday on Friday, 6 days ago. And then Monday, oh my God, a bloodbath for me. It went up 650 points. And altogether, it's gone up 1,250 points in 4 trading days. So I kind of expect, with this fake stock market video game up, what they'd call it profit taking or a pullback. Maybe not tomorrow, because it seems like the Friday after Thanksgiving always wins. But maybe Monday we'll see something happen. I'm hoping. I really want to win this bet, and I don't want to have egg on my face for predicting that 1029 was going to be the all-time high for this cycle. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. In the meantime, that's about it for today. I don't have any baseball news. I do want to go over a little bit of baseball. So I was talking to one of the AI chatbots recently, and it looks like what they're going to do is it's going to be the pitcher, the catcher, and the batter. All 3 of those players are going to have the ability to request a challenge. But the chatbot told me they're only going to get 2 challenges per game, and then they're going to have, I don't know, extra innings will be a different set of rules, maybe 1 per inning, I don't know. But at least for the first 9 innings, it looks like I thought they were going to get 3 challenges, and now it's looking like maybe only 2. But it's not the manager that would call for that. It's going to have to be the catcher, pitcher, or batter that would call for that. The last thing I want to go over on this AI bubble, for some of you that aren't that familiar with it, this so reminds me of April 2000 and .com all over again. So there's these companies that are invested in by the Mag 7. They are suppliers to the Mag 7. They're vendors to them. And they're also customers of the Mag 7. This whole circular accounting thing. So Microsoft is invested in OpenAI. Microsoft is a customer of OpenAI. And Microsoft is a vendor to OpenAI. That doesn't make a bit of sense to me. You just don't see that in normal industries very often at all. And it's Anthropic, it's OpenAI, it's CoreWeave, it's Supermicro. I mean, the list, and it's just a big circle jerk. And they're all, I think a lot of these revenues are just completely outright fake. I think they're kind of doing what Global Crossing and WorldCom were doing back in the .com days, where Global Crossing would come in and say, hey, listen, we've got some fiber optic that connects Tulsa to Oklahoma City, and you've got fiber optic that connects Tulsa to Kansas City. So why don't we do this? I'll sell you some fiber between Tulsa and Kansas City for $1 billion, and you sell some to me that connects Oklahoma City and Tulsa and sell that to me for $1 billion. And then we can go back to our investors. And even though we're each going to write each other a check for $1 billion, we can tell our shareholders, look, we got $1 billion in sales. Look at this. Our revenues are growing so exponentially. That's exactly what's going on here with this AI bubble. It's the same shit all over again. And then the other thing that we also saw during the dot-com was mismatched depreciation schedules. So I think everybody with a brain in their head knows that if you go buy a brand new NVIDIA Blackwell processing chip today to run your AI data center, it's going to be obsolete in 2 or 3 years. You're not going to be able to keep using that forever. But what they're all doing, or at least a lot of them are doing, is they're depreciating those chips over a straight line depreciation method. So in other words, they'll buy a chip for $100 today, and they'll depreciate 18% every year for the next 6 years. So if it's a $1,000 chip, let's say for example, they would depreciate $180 on this year's income statement, and then $180 next year, and $100 for the next 6 years. $180 that comes off their profit and loss. But in reality, the chips aren't going to last that long. They're not going to last anywhere near that long. And then the last thing is, this new Gemini thing that Google came out with over the last couple of weeks. I've been using it as a chatbot, and it seems to be faster, way faster than Grok and ChatGPT both. And it seems like the answers I'm getting are they seem as logical, and I fact check them sometimes, but I usually don't, because I tend to trust whatever they're telling me. And then there's this whole issue with AI slop. I've seen that too. I've seen them make mistakes, and there's also stories of these AI chatbots hallucinating and making up answers out of thin air. So that's a big problem. But how were people going to use this to make money? So I've been investigating that a little bit, and it seems like, they do want people like me to give them my credit card, and they can charge me $20 or $30 a month. And they're like, oh, well, if they can get as much as Netflix or whatever, okay. To me, that's going to be a tough sell when you've got, student loan delinquencies at all-time highs, auto repossessions at all-time highs, all these various problems in this economy, unemployment with the, recent college graduates. Where are they going to come up with all this money to buy all this AI service? I don't, and it's free right now. How are they going to migrate from a free model to, you got to pay us $20, $30? They'd all have to come in and start charging at the same time. It would have to be collusion amongst them, but I'm sure that's not going to be hard for them to do, because they're all invested in and customers of each other and vendors to each other. So I'm sure that'll all happen at once at some point. They'll get us hooked on this and then start charging for it, is my going thesis. But regardless of that, that's not even supposed to be their major revenue source. Their major revenue source is supposed to be enterprises. So a large company like, I don't know, I went through it this summer. MLB Fan Store. I ordered a bunch of t-shirts, and I wanted them shipped to my house, and apparently my order was too big for their system to handle. But when I would try to contact them, they had an 800 number. I would call it, and it was very obvious I wasn't talking to a real human, but it made it sound like it was a human. But it was an AI chatbot, 100%, and that chatbot was absolutely 100% incapable of solving my problem or helping me. But I had to spend 10, 15 minutes on the phone with that damn thing before I could get through to a real human agent that could actually help me and solve the problem. So, and that, I've heard that on Jack Campbell on Nobody Special Finance on YouTube. If you're not listening to him in the mornings, I would recommend it. He's a very smart guy, and he's experienced that, and he's talked about that. But that's what I think of AI. You got this whole slot problem. So how are they, if it's making stuff up and hallucinating, I don't know how you fix that. Maybe they can. But, do I think AI is probably going to wind up changing? Well, first of all, being me, I think it's probably technology that was handed to humanity by fallen angels. The shit just is mind-blowing how it can write sentences and come up with answers so quickly and search the entire internet in seconds. It doesn't seem human to me, but maybe it is. Who knows? The Book of Enoch talks about the fallen angels handing over advanced technologies to humanity, and that's the one book that they decided, the King James, the government version of the Bible, King James, That was the version that they decided not to include in the King James version of the Bible, the Book of Enoch. And a lot of people who have read that book say it's like the Rosetta Stone for understanding the entirety of the rest of the Bible. But that's it for today. I hope you guys have a good Thanksgiving, and we'll be back with podcast number 8. Thank you for listening.